Joining me right now with their thoughts, Republican commentator Mercedes Schlapp and Fox News contributor Leslie Marshall. I mean, Mercedes, you've advised so many campaigns. Authenticity in a candidate matters. Yes, you have people around you helping you, supporting you, giving you information, helping to back up arguments, but shouldn't you fundamentally sort of be generating some of those lines yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I think what you learn with candidates is that actually sometimes the best lines come from the candidates themselves, but it just shows that for Hillary Clinton, her comfort zone is when she's scripted. It's very clear. I mean, you saw it in the past debates. It is calculated, articulated in a way where she is using the poll-tested lines to try to see if somehow she connect to the American people. But when you look at, for example, the speeches that she's given in Wall Street, I mean, you've seen the fact that she says she has struggles to connect with the middle class because obviously her and Bill live in just a different type of way. And so I think Clinton has struggled with authenticity. I think that because of the fact she comes across so scripted, if it wasn't for all of Donald Trump's flaws, I think it's why people, for the most part, don't like her.
Yeah, I mean, look, they don't like her. They've looked for any reason, frankly, Leslie,
that's right,
to not have to vote for her. And yet, you look at the polls, and they're not in his favor right now. Florida, for example, he's going to be campaigning there any minute. What is it that's working for her in Florida that he needs to try and capitalize on?
I think what's working for her in Florida, most battleground states across the board of the Electoral College, is that she is speaking more about issues. Look, Donald Trump was giving a fairly decent Gettysburg Address, if you will, a Trump Gettysburg Address. And then what he does is he opens mouth and opens mouth and inserts a foot. And he does this time and time again. In a sense, Donald gets in his own way. Donald, in a sense, has been, I think, his own worst enemy. And I think Hillary trying to remain on the issues, as we just heard in her speech in New Hampshire, I think that's one of the reasons that she's leading so much in the polls. And people may not like her, but they dislike him more.
They dislike him more. I mean, isn't it a sad state, though, when that's really what it's coming down to?
Yeah, it really
is. How does that... When people go to the voting booths, though, and Mercedes, I'd like to get your perspective on this, because I talk to a lot of people that, when you dig down, they actually sort of secretly are supporting him. They don't want to say it, though. And when you ask them why, it's because they do support him on the issues. They think economically his program is more sound than hers. Less regulation, lower taxes is what the economy needs. Now, they may not like how it's all dressed up with the bow on top, but they feel that policy-wise he is best. Do you think there's something to this in that people will not admit in these polls, and they won't admit to who they're actually voting for because they've been shamed into not doing so?
Well, I have to say, I think the Democrats have been very effective in trying to point the finger and try to call any of Trump's supporters, besides calling them deplorable, but calling them extreme. And so I think it really does make the Trump supporters, a bit more shy, or those people that are on the fence. With that being said, I find it fascinating just traveling in let's say, Northern Virginia, for instance, a battleground state. You barely see signs. You don't see Clinton signs. You don't see Trump signs. There is this silence.
So
there's a sense of saying, I don't know if I like either candidate, but...
Okay, he's out there in Florida today. He's talking about these polls really being phony. Here he is. Watch.
Some great polls have just come out. I believe we're actually winning. Now, the press, I believe we're actually winning. If you read the New York Times, and if you read some of these phony papers, these are phony, disgusting, dishonest papers. But if you read this stuff, it's like, what are we doing? What are we wasting time for? The truth is, I think we're winning.
All right, and yet, you got the ABC poll out, which shows her actually 12 points ahead right now. And yet, Leslie, I got to say, some of these have been all over the place. How much stock do you put in them?
Well, after the primary, when we saw not just between Hillary and Bernie, but also between Donald and all the other people on that platform, we've seen a lot of errors that came out from the polls. And I would have to say, I'm not putting the biggest stock in the polls, but I am looking at the numerical analysis that is out
Electoral
there, state by
college,
state, for the Electoral College. And with that,
and it's
a
tough.
very, very
It's
hard, a very, very hard way for him to get to the White House.
So you bring up a very important point. Mercedes, he's got 15 days to go. Which states would you be telling him spend the most time in now?
Donald Trump needs to move into Mar-a-Lago and spend as much time as he can in Florida, as much time as he can in North Carolina and Nevada. Those are going to be critical states for him. I'm looking at Florida very, very closely because that's the one state, as we know, and usually in presidential elections, that will be incredibly important. If Clinton wins Florida, it is over.
Well, very, very interesting. I'm going to talk to you guys in a little bit, so don't go anywhere. Thank you so much, Mercedes and Leslie. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, 50-50. Fox News contributors Mercedes Schlapp and Leslie Marshall are back with me. You know, Mercedes, I'm always sort of perplexed by this. Now, I'm an independent, so I have no problem crossing the aisle, you know, for whichever candidate I may be voting for. But what perplexes me is, what is the thought here? Is that, you know, people are just literally going to make a big X through Republican or Democrat? Is it that some Republicans might stay home? I mean, they don't think that they can cross the aisle at all?
Well, it's actually a fascinating dynamic, I think, this election cycle, because of the fact that you might actually see the split ballot. It could be a person voting for Trump, but then they're mad at the senator who's running in let's say Nevada, for example. Heck, who's running in that state, for example, said that he was not going to be supporting Donald Trump. So they might get mad at them and not vote for Heck. But then you have the other case scenario in the Republican world where they say, I'm not voting for Donald Trump, but I'm going to vote for my Republican senator. And those are the two, I think, dynamics that we're seeing right now being played out in the Republican side. And that's what makes these Senate battleground states, so these battleground states with these senators up for grabs, these Senate seats up for grabs, very interesting, and to see what will actually end up on election day.
Republicans, they just haven't been willing to stick together. I mean, really, from the get-go, right? In this election, we went through a miserable primary process. The media, of course, we loved it. But in terms of the country as a whole, they really got exposed to perhaps the worst side of politics, in that there were so many candidates taking so many jabs at each other, Leslie, that it really left a somewhat fractured party in the end. And Republicans just haven't been able to get their act together. And do you think it's going to cost them?
Oh, yes. I think it is going to cost him. I think it depends on what you look at. 538 has a Democratic takeover in the Senate at 73%. I don't always trust their numbers. Look, you need 4 seats, and it really looks like Wisconsin and Illinois are going to be in Democrat, column. Then we have to look at certain states. You just talked about the fragmentation in the party, and I think one clear example of that is in New Hampshire, where you have Kelly Ayotte, who has basically said, I'm for Trump, I'm against Trump, and I think it's actually confused voters. As a matter of fact, her competitor, Maggie Hassan, has done better this past week than she's done this whole election cycle. So I think we're seeing some of that coming out right now.
You know, perhaps part of Senator Ayotte's problem was that she, on the one hand, she's sort of this John McCain protege and has been close to him and sort of traditional conservatives. On the other hand, Donald Trump's message was resonating like, nobody's business there in New Hampshire. So how does she walk that line? You can't really walk it. I think, what did Margaret Thatcher say? You got to be on one side or the other, because if you stay in the middle of the road, you're going to get run over. And that's to a certain extent what has happened, in fact, in New Hampshire. Mercedes, just, I think, a day before the whole Billy Bush, Donald Trump tape came out, she was quoted as saying Donald Trump is a wonderful role model. And she was forced into saying that in part because she had gotten herself stuck saying effectively that he wasn't. What advice would you give to Kelly Ayotte right now as she tries to win the Senate seat in New Hampshire?
Look, I think at this point, and is what I think Kelly Ayotte should have stuck to in the first place, is the fact that she's an effective senator. She's very strong on the Foreign Relations Committee. And the fact that stick to the policies, stick to what works. This is, I think, where the Republicans have ended up focusing so much on temperament, tone, personality. let's talk about the fact that the Republican solutions would be better for America. And I think that's where these candidates need to go. Enough with the Donald Trump part. Just stay focused on your race and say, look, this is what we need to work on. We need to keep a Senate majority with Republicans in order to ensure that we're able to push
Mike
forward.
Pence has done this well, right? I mean, Mike Pence has sort of said, look, Donald Trump's a little rough around the edges, but ultimately, who do you want in charge of the Supreme Court?
And go after Hillary Clinton's corruption. That's huge. I mean, I think that is an area where Republicans sometimes are so focused on criticizing Donald Trump. Instead of saying, okay, our goal here is to defeat Hillary Clinton, let's focus on the WikiLeaks, the corruption, the fact that it's a pay-for-play scheme, and really let the American people realize that we're going to put in the Clinton cartel in the White House if we move in that direction.
Leslie, what Mercedes is describing is effectively politics 101, right? Go for the enemy. Join forces. You're stronger together. Do you think they will learn their lesson should he not succeed?
I think they will, possibly. I have to agree with Mercedes somewhat, okay, because this is politics 101. Democrats did this with Obamacare, right, with the Affordable Care Act, right? I'm for it. I voted for it. Oh, don't remember I voted for it. And I agree with you, Trish. If you got to own it. If you're going to support that candidate, support that candidate. Mike Pence has done that. I don't support those words, but I still
He's
am
done
buying my teammate and my candidate or
a
this
wonderful
policy.
job walking that line. Go ahead, Mercedes.
Support the candidates, warts and all, okay? That's how it goes.
Yeah, that's the only way to win.
Both flawed and imperfect. At this point, you got to go and attack Hillary Clinton and just understand that Trump is flawed, but he has the right agenda for America.
Mercedes, good to see you. Leslie, thank you so much. All right, we've got some breaking